My name is Tamilia, and I live in Jersey City.
I'm Nicole. I use he and she pronouns, and I also live in Jersey City. We live together.
We live together. How did COVID-19 affect our community and family and community at large? There's so much I can say. My parents who were not vaccinated got COVID. I was living in Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn. Moved to Jersey in the middle of the pandemic or the beginning of the pandemic. I had a lot of community affected, especially during the uprising. When we were organizing, a lot of us had to be on the ground, dealing with folks who were, coming in and out of being incarcerated. Some of them didn't wear masks, some of them did, having to navigate people on the ground, getting COVID, and then possibly not sure if it spread to other people, because this is before we were able to get tested or had access to any of that stuff. What about similarly, I think?
So for me, definitely just being Filipino, where a lot of my family and friends are nurses, so it was really hard in the beginning just knowing that eventually they were going to be exposed, and it felt like soldiers going into war without, the proper PPE, without the proper weapons or whatever. So it was scary. My mom is a nurse manager, and she's been a nurse for 40 years and trying to retire, and I was hoping she could retire in the middle of a pandemic. She did get COVID in May 2020, and that was really hard. We had to rush her to the emergency room twice, and thankfully she did recover. And I just had a lot of friends and community who were frontline workers in New York, and just hearing their stories and just seeing how, just traumatized they were, and just having to show up every day. And I had friends who were tired of hearing the the sirens and all of that. And on my end, I was also community organizing in Jersey City. So through our organization, a grassroots organization, I was helping a trans person in our community who was houseless and living out of a storage thing and didn't have phone service, and trying to get food to her. So even just having to work with other community-based organizations, even churches and things, just to get basic needs met in the middle of a pandemic was really hard.
And shelters too, trying to get folks housed into shelters because of the different everything, every social service, every grassroots org, everything that services the people, everything was changed. All of the protocols were changed, and trying to get everyone informed was definitely a struggle with community, as well as elders, because everything now went digitally. We were having Zoom, trying to get elders on board with that and figuring out how they can get access to it. That was also very hard.
Yeah, all the problems that existed before the pandemic were just way exacerbated. And even if you were a community organizer and you were used to doing this kind of work, our capacities were challenged too, and eventually I burned out because just it was a lot.
Yeah.
What was it like? What was it like getting into a relationship during the pandemic? It was cool. It was we met over OkCupid. On our first Zoom, we talked for 3 hours or something. This one, you want me to say it or you want to say it?
Go ahead.
This one decided, we'll just be friends, and then we're not romantically aligned. And I was like, fine, that's cool, because we connected a lot. And then months went by. We kept watching movies together, like Mortal Kombat, all the weird throwback movies.
That you hadn't seen, Zoom hangs.
Yeah, so a lot of Zoom hangs. And then eventually we met up in person on our favorite holiday, Dia de los Muertos. In Haiti, it's Fête Quede, and in the Philippines, it's Undas. So we met in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. No intentions of dating, just literally honoring, making space for all the death and grief that was happening around us.
Yeah.
And yeah. And eventually after that, just realizing, oh, there's more, so.
Yeah, I think what helped me, I think, I'm not often a very shy person, or I don't often get nervous, but I think accessing vulnerability, accessing intimacy through Zoom was a lot greater, because typically I wouldn't bring someone home on possibly, but in this case I wasn't going to bring anyone home on the first day. But on the first Zoom hang, we she was in my room essentially on the computer screen. And I think the level of vulnerability was a lot greater, and so the capacity to being friends, I think, happened a lot. There was more room to honor a friendship during COVID, but also there was a lot of grief. So it was nice to have companionship. I think that was the biggest thing, is for a lot of folks to feel connected to others, because, when you're not able to see each other in person, or everything is regulated, how do you form connections? I didn't go in with the intention of getting into a relationship, but I think the pandemic kind of facilitated a lot of things that I don't think I would have experienced if the pandemic didn't happen.
Yeah. When you're talking about vulnerability too, it's like you have that screen as a protection for a little bit. And then even when we're during our first conflicts, it was solved over Zoom.
Yeah.
And it was like that for months until maybe July 2021, when we actually had a conflict in person, and we're discovering more layers to ourselves and our dynamic together. So
things that a screen kind of could, like you said, contain a barrier around things. And there was more room for, I think, talking, as opposed to just immediate reaction and being imperfect and human, as I think in person would allow you to be. And there was kind of more preparedness behind the screen that I think allowed us to kind of flourish in our friendship, and then now relationship, until we met in person and finally got to deal with the things that make you human. Are we vaccinated? Yes. We both are vaccinated, both have the two doses. We did not get the boosters.
Yeah.
In terms of getting the vaccine, I work in healthcare. That is my 9-to-5 job. And I was able to have access to the vaccine pretty quickly. And I was also, I had access to, there was no question for me. I think because it was during flu season, right before the pandemic hit, I had literally the worst flu I've ever experienced in my life. And my fear was that when the pandemic was happening, that I wouldn't know if it was the flu or if it was COVID. And the risk that I was willing to take seemed a lot greater, because I didn't know what was going on. And when you have the probability of both cases, you might die. I'd rather be vaccinated and die. And it sounds pretty morbid, but that's kind of the survival thinking I had in that moment. There was no question for me. It was more so just I need to get me and my community vaccinated. And
you did an event where you helped them get signed up.
I helped predominantly. It was through, I forgot the organization, but my job had hosted an organization that was facilitating specifically with BIPOC elders in Queens to get vaccinated. And so much of why it was important for me to go was because, a lot of Black elders specifically, have history and understanding of a lot of medical trauma. There's a huge history of medical trauma within the Black community. And so the idea that, someone who looks like them, who might be able to not convince anyone, my goal is never to convince, it's more so just to kind of here are all your options, here are all your choices, and then you make the best choice for yourself, as opposed to what I was seeing a lot of, what is it called? Manipulating people into getting the vaccine or shaming them, and I get it because it's rooted in fear, but I think just having people understand what it is that's happening, as opposed to navigating from a place of fear, I think that was important. What about you?
Yeah, I don't remember if, I'm sure we did talk about it. I don't really entirely remember what our conversation around it was, but I knew that because they were kind of phasing it out, that I probably wasn't going to get it for a while. And also, a lot of our conversations, especially initially, were just, focusing on Black and brown working class folks and centering their needs and our needs. And, I saw that they were doing like test trials in Newark, which is a predominantly Black community, and just more continued rage along with the uprisings that year. Just a lot of rage and grief happening in terms of just all of it, and then thinking about the vaccine as well.
Yeah.
It was our executive director, Liz, who reached out to me over Instagram and asked if I wanted to get the vaccine because Hudson Pride was trying to get all of the LGBTQ community vaccinated. So I wasn't even looking to get it, but I was able to get it pretty early on in 2021.
I remember that.
Yeah. But it's hard too because I also have family in the Philippines, and it's the whole world. It's a pandemic, so everyone's impacted, and I don't even remember if my Lola, my grandma, was vaccinated, but she eventually did pass from COVID at the end of 2021. So yeah, the impacts are just very real, and I definitely understand why some people might not want to get vaccinated with the historical things that the U.S. has done. So yeah,
and I think for us it was never really a question. It was just more so hoping that community can get vaccinated as quick as possible, and then we could.
Yeah, and then also trying to convince our parents to get vaccinated. Yeah. I at least was trying to get them vaccinated, and they eventually did. So
yeah. It's interesting to say that because it's such a double-edged sword, I think, because I think there was a lot of orgs who were centering more historically disenfranchised communities in terms of getting vaccines. I was stationed in Queens and, within the NYCHA, New York City housing space, a lot of elders. I don't know if the question is, was it readily available? It's how informed people were, or how were people taking the time to get informed. I remember volunteering at the NYCHA housing in Queens, and there were, folks who came in to get vaccinated, and they're not from that area. They're white. They came in like a really fancy car, and they came there because they knew that this neighborhood was getting vaccinated first, and so they made any excuse. Oh, I was a flight attendant, or all of these things to get vaccinated. So I don't think there was no access to vaccines, and I could be completely wrong, but I know that the biggest hurdle, for me at least, was just making sure that the people who had access to the vaccine were well informed, as opposed to just being told you need to take the vaccine because it's better for you in your neighborhood, or shaming people into thinking that they need to get vaccinated to take care of the other people around them, but more so like understanding the medical trauma, understanding the historical trauma, and here's the information at hand, and you do with that what you will. So I think I just wish that people had more access to information, or I think that's what the biggest hurdle, at least I found.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it as deeply as you had. I was gonna say, I think now it's a lot more accessible. I don't know, I feel like what also might help with getting people vaccinated, it's this weird like contradiction in between where like we've been forced to go back to work in person, and there's no requirement for masks, but also you're not going to get COVID pay anymore, and now like housing, whatever was on pause, rent payments, all of that, like we're moving forward back to normal, which I don't think is a real thing, and we're expected to function in a certain way that just is not sustainable or possible or healthy for any community. And I'm like, if like COVID pay was still available, if the rental assistance, all of that was still as readily available as it was not even readily available, it took a while, and people had to fight to even get these things. So if the structure of the capitalist system in the US was, it's not created it's not created in any way to really support the people. So yeah, I feel like people would probably be more apt to get the vaccine and want to learn more information if they actually felt supported and like all of their basic needs were already being met. I saw, you see in other countries people were getting food like for free, and it was just set up really well. I don't know if it was like Thailand or Taiwan or somewhere, but like they did it well. we continued in the capitalist way that America works. So
and I didn't also factor in the when you do get the vaccine, like the possibility of what it would look like to have it, like the symptoms. Like I literally felt like I was dying, and so thinking of folks who are taking it and have those symptoms may not be able to go to work, or, if they don't have sick days, they have to now have a day of no work for that day, because of the symptoms. And everybody had such different symptoms, but I know for me, I felt them both times. And so just kind of having community know about that, like the risk factors, just everything, so that they can make a most conscious choice. Even when we were considering getting boosters, we knew that we would have to separate the times that we would get it. Right. Because if I got the booster first and she got the booster first, or she
if we got it at the same time, we can't take care of each other.
We can't take care of each other, or we can't do our general household things and just
or even work.
Function, or working, or even driving, or whatever. So we had to stagger it out kind of when considering any vaccine of any sorts. When we were in the pandemic, everything was done virtual. I have done so many classes and workshops, more than I could ever have done in person when the pandemic happened. I think having things kind of stay the way they did before the pandemic happened, and when the pandemic, quote unquote, was over, it was back to business, but we're not operating, what has it been, 3 years, I think, or 2 years, we're fundamentally not functioning that way. I think the state could do a better job at, I don't know if hearing the concerns of the people, right, because it's such a mass population of people who have different struggles and who are navigating different things, and I believe it's not easy to try to cater to every single person's needs, but I think just having accessibility options, having people be more well-versed on what's happening, be more well-versed on their choices, be more well-versed on their options for them so that they can make the best decision for themselves. I don't think that was happening. It was more so rooted in shame, fear, all of these things that center our choices often, especially within capitalism. So I think if people knew their choices and knew that there was knew what their options were, I think people would be able to make the best choices for themselves.
As I had said previously, just, still holding some of those policies of the rental assistance and not kicking folks out, and now there's more houseless folks. Just meeting basic needs before this extra layer of protection, which is the vaccine. So it would have to be, in my opinion, just a whole huge policy, not even just policy shift, but uprooting of old systems and a creation of new ones. But progress is slow and uneven. Slow and uneven, but over time, I think people started to think differently about how we actually want to live in this world, and not having to use the old systems that weren't working for us anyway, and trying to just copy paste it into a future that has completely been rewritten by the pandemic. Yeah. So.
And I also think, unfortunately, folks who were, in any capacity would not have been affected by, financially or what have you, by COVID. I think when they had someone directly impact them, that's when it became an issue, an important issue that, it's of concern. I know folks who had long-term COVID, and now are fighting the good fight of the importance of COVID and still masking. I'm not very rigid on masking, as you can tell, but I think everyone is going to have their own understanding of how important it is. My parents are still not vaccinated. They did not want to get vaccinated, and they got COVID, and we had to fly out to Texas to go take care of them because they were both bedbound. And my dad is 73. My mom has diabetes, have all of these, immunocompromised, parts of her that would have been dangerous, and she was hospitalized right before. And so, then my dad saw how terrible it was on his body, and he said, I'm going to do whatever it takes. I'll get the vaccine. He still hasn't gotten the vaccine, but it triggered something in him of
it's important.
It's important. Yeah. Unfortunately, I wish that was not the case, where something bad has to happen in order for people to have this idea oh, maybe this should be done. Mm-hmm. But if the majority or the immunocompromised who are already affected by it aren't enough to signal that this is important, I don't know what else could be done. It's hard to say, because I think there's so much could be done, but is capitalism willing to expend itself in that way to get it done?
Yeah, and I'm even thinking in a doable, we're thinking of other systems that can happen, but in this one, states could support just folks still having the option to be virtual, because even folks with disabilities, they were enraged that now it's so accessible, and I've seen universities making classes now in person, and there's no option for hybrid. So the folks who were, the people who are disabled, are now not able to have the access that they did have for a year or two.
Yeah.
So I
also
think
mental health.
Yeah.
I think because we're all traumatized by it, and so much information is around everywhere. I think mental health, centering the mental well-being of folks who are now have to be productive again and get back to quote unquote normal. I think just a whole holistic, and Yeah, it feels like such a faraway thing, to kind of hope that these things would happen. But I think just even on the small scale, us being able to connect with our community, where we live in Jersey City, we live on West Side, and connect with our communities. And anytime that we know of a vaccine happening or whatever, like when monkeypox vaccine happened, we made sure, huh?
I think it's Mpox now.
Oh,
They
Mpox.
don't want a racial thing. Anyway.
Mpox, we made sure that everyone in our neighborhood knew that it was happening, put on posters and stuff like that. Of course, it was still very taboo. And, I think you can't force anyone to get the vaccine, but I think just for me and just being proactive to make sure that people are aware of the choices they have.
Yeah, so I want to just acknowledge that we are still feeling the impacts of the pandemic. A term that my therapist has used is like complicated grief. And we're still being asked to function in a way that, is not, everyone's struggling with like mental health. And, I work in a community-based organization, and a lot of the calls that we get are for housing, food, mental health, and these are problems that existed beforehand. And, I don't really believe that anything has gotten any better in terms of, really addressing the root of all those causes. But I don't know, I feel like it would be nice to have like a day or a few days or a whole week to just like nationally mourn everything that was lost, and everyone who was lost, and that's more. I know, I'm a triple Pisces, so I don't know, just we learn to live with the grief. It doesn't get smaller, but we learn how to carry it better. And a day like that would be more like optics, but something, any kind of acknowledgement would be.
Yeah. I think my last words, or final words, when we were in Texas, right before we left, we got yelled at by this guy, and he was just like, the pandemic is over. I think everyone is at their own stages of grief. I think many people want to just sweep it under the rug and forget it because it was more of a hindrance. It took you away from your friends and your family and the people you loved and your community, and I get that. And also, there are still people who are actively suffering for it, and I think I just want to remind myself and people to, we have, America tells us to live in a very black and white world where it's either this or that. I just hope that we're also thinking of the nuance and that it's not always just, this or that, that we're existing, just like you said. We're grieving, and everyone grieves in very different ways. The guy yelling at us, I wanted to cut his tires, but I think we were wearing masks walking out of their parents' apartment, and they had COVID, and then he said that to us. And that's his way of grieving. He's angry. He doesn't like having the masks might show him that, there's still something that he needs to be doing with himself. And that's not mine to hold, So I think that's the last words. It's just we're all carrying things, and just remind yourself what's yours and what's not yours to hold. Yeah, and just keep taking care of each other. Yeah. Really. And not in a philosophical way, but like literally, physically, tangible Samelia's taught me a lot of just like really knowing your neighbors and being able to support each other in different needs. And even just like being on Instagram at the beginning of the pandemic, folks are like, you can put things on your neighbors' doors and be like, hey, if you need anything, leave my number. Yeah. And that did help. Like one of my neighbors was able to help my mom and get groceries when she had COVID. So, just continuing those little practices of collective care. Yeah.